And now we go on with the distinguished visitor professor. He's a visiting professor in G. Raymond Chang School of Continuing Education in Ryerson University. The title of his presentation is "What We Have Learned About Designing Successful Online Courses and Programs." And I think with this speech we will complete the first zone of our Congress. And now you have the speech, Dr. Don Bates, please.
Well, good afternoon, good evening. It must be a very long day for you. So let me get it straight into the presentation. I'm going to try and share my screen. I can't get into the share screen. Can you release me to do that? Oh, okay. I'm going to have to check out of my browser and come back in again. Okay, share screen, application window, share. Okay, I hope you can see that. Can you see that? Can you see my?
Of course, Dr. Bates.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. My browser started to play up, but I managed to get around that. First of all, let me say I have, as Michael Moore has just said, I have great sympathy for any teacher in this situation. This is not how we would like to do education, but we have to do the best we can in the circumstances. What I'm going to do is to give a brief introduction and talk somewhat about the limitations of online learning. You probably feel sometimes that somebody's trying to sell you something here, which you may not feel is the right thing for you. And you may be right in some circumstances. So I want to talk about the limitations first, before going on to talk about how we can actually do online learning very well. And then what comes next after this, as a result of what I'm going to say. And first, let me give you some definitions. You heard Michael talk about distance education, but that's only one kind of online learning. That's fully online learning, which is where the student doesn't see or is in contact with the student, with the professor. And then at the other end, you have face-to-face teaching without any technology. But in the middle, there's this blended model, which can be anything from just adding classroom aids like PowerPoint, to flipped classroom, where you record the lecture and students come in and discuss the lecture in person, or you can have what's called a hybrid model, where some of the course is taught online and some face-to-face. So really now, at one time, fully online was completely different from face-to-face, but now it's becoming more mixed. And I think that as we move into the next September, we're going to be moving more into that blended mode and less fully online. But again, that will depend on the rate of infection and so on. So it's necessary to be flexible here. Secondly, I want to say we know what works. And probably Michael Moore has said a lot about this, but we have 30 years of experience of teaching online and at a distance. And we've identified many best practices through research and evaluation. Unfortunately, much of this research into best practice is not known by teachers and especially administrators. They're not aware of what the best practices are in online teaching. And the best practices are not just taking what you do in a classroom and trying to replicate it online. So I want to talk about the 9 steps to quality online teaching, 9 things you can do as a teacher to make sure you're doing quality online teaching. Let me talk first about some of the limitations. I want to talk particularly about access and technology, because knowing how your students are going to be learning and what technology they have available will affect your decisions about how to deliver programs. Now, if you're going to use video, the student on their computer, the learner, the child, must have at least 10 megabits per second download for effective video. And there are 2 ways to do video. One is synchronously, which is live, like this conference, using tools like Zoom or the tool that's being used here. Or it can be asynchronous, that's recorded and then played later to the student, or played as many times as the student wants, because they can access it whenever they need to. And you can do that through YouTube, or you can record Zoom recordings. So the technology here is quite important in determining what technology you should use. And the second area of online learning is primarily text-based, where students use a keyboard and read things on their screen. You can use low bandwidth for this, 2 to 10 megabits per second. You can use email plus virtual learning environments or learning management systems such as Moodle. And the important distinction between this is that it's only asynchronous. Students can access the learning whenever they want to, at any time they want to. But in both cases, whether it's video or text-based, they need appropriate equipment. They need a computer or a tablet, and they need access to the internet. Now, in Greece, 20% of homes will not have broadband access. So video is not an appropriate way to teach at least 1 in 5 students in Greece. You need to use asynchronous technologies such as learning management systems. Incidentally, I would not even put PowerPoint slides up on a learning management system, because they take a lot of bandwidth. This particular PowerPoint slide is something like 12, 15 megabits. So it won't download very fast. And it won't, if you have lots of PowerPoint slides, again, it's a big problem for access. And 15% in Greece will not have any adequate internet access for study purposes. This data is from LSAT, the Greek Statistical Agency. And some households, maybe an extra 5 to 10%, cannot afford equipment or data. They just don't have the money to pay for the technology. Now, this is a sizable minority. It's about probably 10 to 15% of all households in Greece. So alternative arrangements then are absolutely necessary for this sizable minority. Alternative arrangements might be that these students from these households would get priority for face-to-face class attendance using social distancing. So if you can only have a small proportion of students come to school, these are the students who should get priority. The second alternative arrangement for this group would be to provide them with the equipment, or the government to provide funding for that specific group of low-income people so that they can access online learning. So there has to be government policy here for that 15 to 20%. Now, you may have that in Greece, but I haven't done the research. I don't know if that's there, but it's absolutely essential, because the major advantage of a public education system is that it provides access to all. And if you're using technology, you've got to find a way to meet those needs of those students who don't have access. Okay, now what are the other limitations of online learning? It's not for all students. If it's okay for your older students in school, 16 to 18-year-olds, they should be able to manage online learning if it's done properly. So they have enough maturity and enough responsibility. I know I have 16 to 18-year-old grandsons, and I do hesitate when I say that, but they should be able to manage it. 8 to 15 years old, it can be used for specific purposes, for doing specific learning tasks. Below 7 to 8, it's really difficult. You cannot replace the need for social learning outside the family with online learning. And one of the big concerns I have is the development of young people below, say, 7 years old, who are missing out on the social learning they get from being outside the family, but in a secure and safe environment. And that's very hard to replace, or impossible to replace, by online learning. And for all these groups of students, for whatever age, parental support is critical. And I will say more about what that support should be, because the students need some kind of surrogate to the teacher to help them, but not to do the teacher's job. Not to do the teacher's job. I'll explain what I think the role of the parent is in a moment. What we do know online learning is good for, if it's properly designed, it's very good for content transmission, for getting over lots of information to students. It's good for certain kinds of soft skills development. In particular, it's good for developing reading, writing, math skills. Students can do interesting project work online, and they can get some social contact with other students if you manage properly the online discussion forums, or maybe if you're using Zoom, the Zoom breakout groups. It's very good for asynchronous communication, for students being able to access students and study at any time, at any place. And it's good for online collaborative learning, a form of collaborative learning that's different from collaborative learning in the class, but still teaches students skills of empathy, of learning to compromise with other students and in order to get work done. So there are lots of good skills you can do online, even with younger children. But it is difficult for most practical work, labs, equipment use, studio work. Now, that's also changing. Some alternative activities can be done at home that replicate practical work. And I know many teachers are being inventive in finding things for students to do at home that replicate some of the active work, particularly in art and studies, creative areas. And it's particularly difficult for social development in children, and particularly the younger children, as I've mentioned. And it relies heavily on parental support, but not direct teaching by parents. So here's the first step, and this is probably the most difficult one, particularly if you're working with an official state curriculum. The first question I would ask is the official curriculum appropriate in this crisis? Is it asking students to do things, for instance, that they can't do at home? What I would do in your situation, and I know this is very difficult, I would focus on the core learning outcomes specified in the curriculum. Reading, writing, math, oral communication, language development. And I would ask what can wait a year. You know, knowing the history of Alexander the Great, that will be there next year as well as this year. It won't have changed. Whereas a child learning to read, that can actually cause a lot of damage to a student if they don't learn to read during the year. So focus on the core learning outcomes while teaching online, and maybe you have to tweak the curriculum in order to do that. And thirdly, work out the best ways to reach these outcomes in a home environment. And I would particularly emphasize thinking about off-screen activities. In other words, what kind of activities can students do away from the computer, like reading or writing, and which they can then bring back and share with the teacher and other students in the class. And I want to emphasize student learner activities in online learning as being critical, because otherwise they lose motivation, they become very passive, and they don't develop these core learning outcomes very well. So off-screen activities are very important because young children particularly are probably getting too much screen time already without having to go online for teaching. So keep the teaching screen activities as limited as possible, but give them other things to do at home that are feasible for most students. Also rethink your teaching in terms of the role of parents. I ask you strongly to collaborate with parents. Many parents will be working and won't have a lot of time, but they do care about their kids more than anybody else, and they will help if they can, but you have to give them the right kind of activities. Ask them to talk and read and listen and ask questions about the work that you've set for the students. Get them to not tell them what to do, but particularly ask good questions. Why do you think that's right, for instance? Get them to explain what they're doing. So get them to teach you, because if they can teach you, they're going to learn very quickly. So your job, the job of a parent, is a very sensitive one here, of not being too directive about what they have to learn, because that's the teacher's job, but providing support and assistance to the student. And that means being very clear in your directions as to what you want parents to do in order to help their children. And again, remember that their time is limited as well, particularly if they're working from home. Structure times for learning, that's what you want the parents to do. Michael Moore's already mentioned that. Make sure that students have regular times to work. Use home-based projects where children can find information, write reports, make videos, or even podcasts. Kids love doing this, and it's a very good way for them to show what they're learning to you. And prepare a good guide for parents, and try to avoid stress for the parents. Try to make sure that it's not, they understand it's not their responsibility to teach the children. That's your responsibility. Their responsibility is love and support for the child when they're learning. Step 2, what kind of course? Will it be blended in September? I don't know with the situation in Greece. I don't think anybody knows what the situation will be once all the tourists arrive in Greece. I'm very worried about what will happen, and you must be too. But focus in school on what can't be done at home. If the kids are coming to school, for goodness sake, don't give them a lecture. Don't do lectures online for the students who can't come to school, with kids in the school having the same lecture. Focus on what can't be done at home. I'm thinking particularly of social activities, learning activities, but are socially based, using obviously social distancing, but allowing children to communicate with each other. Make sure work at home is done and bring it to school if they're coming to school, and shared in school. In other words, give some work out what's best done at home, what the student should be doing at home. This is a kind of extended kind of homework, but very focused on the learning outcomes, and also not just homework, but how it fits in with what they do when they come to school. And of course, the younger the child, the more time they should be spending at school. I don't know what's happening in Greece. In British Columbia, primary school students will go 1 day in 2 to school, and high school students will go 1 day in 5, because the younger child needs much more time in that social environment. Step 3, as Michael says, work in a team. Online learning is different, and he's emphasized very strongly that course design is critical. Now, the team here is you and other teachers and parents. Hopefully there's an online teaching specialist somewhere in your school system that you can go to, and librarians particularly are very important here, because they can find resources that you can use, or that students can access at home, online learning resources that you can then build in to your teaching. Share experience and resources with other teachers, and develop online and home activities for students, and above all, manage your workload. I'll come to student workload in a moment, but one reason for working in a team is to try to take some of that huge amount of work off your shoulders and share it with other people. Build on existing resources. If, I don't know what's happening in Greece, but if your school has an official learning management system or virtual learning environment, then use that. Don't try to get around that. There's a reason for using that kind of tool. Don't argue about which is best. There's not much difference between them, Moodle or Desire to Learn or Blackboard and so on. What really matters is how you use those tools. And similarly, web conferencing, Zoom or whatever this is, they all work reasonably the same. What's more important is how you want to use those tools. So take what you've got and use that. Secondly, open education resources. These are resources that are free to use for teaching purposes. Now, this is a problem. In English, we have many open educational resources in the English language. I'm not sure what the policy has been in Greece about creating teaching and learning, digital teaching and learning resources that students can access online and use, such as open textbooks, for instance. If your colleagues have developed a good graphic or done created something interesting and are willing to share it, use that rather than try to do everything yourself. In other words, find ways to save time when going online, but particularly use existing resources. I put up OpenDelos here, which is a Greek virtual learning system, I believe, and I think there's a web conferencing system as well that's been developed. This is probably developed for post-secondary education, but there's no reason why it shouldn't be used for high schools particularly. Step 5, master the technology. Get to know how to use the tools that you're going to use. The virtual learning environment is very important for providing the course structure for students, what they should do each week. So you need to know how to use that properly. This is an asynchronous tool. You should be able to learn everything that a virtual learning environment does in a maximum of 5 hours. It's well worth doing that. You'll find you can do tests, you can have online discussion forums, you can collect data about what the students are doing so you can track how well students are doing. It's really worth learning how to use these tools. And these tools aren't going to go away after COVID-19. They will still be useful for you as teachers in the classroom environment, because students can go online in your class and do research and come back using a virtual learning management system. Relate, though, that training technology to how you want to teach. Ask the person running the course on the virtual learning environment. How can I do this in the virtual learning environment? I want to get students to write essays. How can I do this in the virtual learning environment? What's the best way to set that up? So make sure it's relevant to your teaching, and design and request a course template. What's the course template? Well, if you're teaching, say, math, there may be a certain way you like to teach math. You may want to set up the objectives so that students know what they're trying to achieve. You may have activities built in that they have to do every week. You can design a template that allows you to really easily insert each of those activities. And really, for each subject area, there should be a kind of standard template that you have some flexibility to change if you want, but basically it gives you a kind of route through the teaching online. And lastly, don't get into technology wars about which of these is the best. All virtual learning environments do the same job pretty well. So don't try to get out of it by saying, well, I don't like this tool, I'd rather use that tool. Because you can confuse students then. If students going from one teacher to another, and one teacher uses one virtual learning system and another teaches another virtual learning environment, that's really confusing for the students. So some kind of standardization here actually makes life a lot simpler. Step 6, set and communicate your learning goals. So see step 1, are you doing something new or different here because you've had to move to an online learning environment? But clearly communicate what children need to learn in the course at the start of the course and share that with the parents. This is what you're going to learn through this course. And here's what you should be able to do at the end of the course. That has to be very clear when students are online. They have to know why they're doing things. And be very clear about what's to be done at home and what's to be done at school. And in particular, communicate how you're going to assess or grade students. What is the strategy? How are you going to do that? How are you going to do it, and when are you going to do it? I could say a lot. I could spend the whole time talking about assessment strategy, but one of the great things about online learning is that you can track students' work as they're doing it. Now, I did say some of it will be done offline, but then they have to bring it online at some point. So if they do a podcast, they have to then bring it and put it online. So you can see what they've done. So you can assess continuously rather than an end of term exam, which is again going to be difficult in a COVID-19 situation. Design the structure and the learning activities. Set up a schedule in the learning management system. The most important thing is to be clear about the average weekly study time, school and home, that learners are supposed to take on this class, remembering that they're probably taking other classes as well, particularly in high schools from other teachers. And that average weekly study time should include all their activities, what they do off-screen and on-screen, in school, out of school, what they do for assessment and activities and so on. In higher education, for a normal course, I would say something like 8 to 10 hours study time for most students. But in school, I don't know how we would work that study time out. It's not the hours of contact, it's the hours of study. And once you've worked that out, you have to fit all your activities and all the work that students do within that reasonable space of time. And you know that some students will take longer and some students will do it more quickly, but work out a kind of rough average for the class. Then work out every week, what's it going to be? Is it going to be a topic? I'm going to cover Alexander the Great's conquest of Persia, or is it going to be a project, like how did people fight in the olden days and so on? And is this going to be weekly or is it flexible? The older the child, the more flexible you can be. The younger the child, the more you have to structure their learning. Then decide the learner activities. What do the students have to do in order to reach the learning outcome? Read, research, discuss, do. And particularly when you go online, avoid giving them too much content. Avoid giving them too much to read, or too many activities for that matter. Again, come back to this average study time. What can they do in the time available, and what should be done at home, and what can be done at school? And relate every activity to the outcomes and assessment, so that students know that what they're doing will count towards their grade, and how it will count towards a grade, for instance, and also relate it to what kind of learning outcomes you specified. This will help you read better by doing this activity. Step 8, communicate, communicate, communicate. Because you can't see them and they're not in front of you, doesn't mean to say they're not there. The most important single variable in successful online learning is instructor presence, teacher presence, being present online every day, so that students know that you're watching what they're doing online and care about it. It's not just enough to know they're doing things, but respond to it. Not every student, not every comment, because they can see your comments to other students if they're in a discussion forum, for instance. So, but nevertheless, every day, try to communicate in some way with your class so that every student in the class sees something from you every day. Set clear expectations for learners and parents. Tell them exactly what you're expecting of them. Have clear learning goals, activities, and deadlines, and communicate these to students. Make children do the work. They're the ones that have to learn. Get them to go off and do little projects and come back and share the work with you. Monitor their learning activities. And if you get a question from a parent or a child, try to respond, I say, within 48 working hours. So if they ask me at 9 o'clock on a Friday evening, I don't expect them to get a response until maybe Monday morning. But nevertheless, they know when they should expect a response from you. And lastly, innovate and evaluate. This is a challenge, but it's also exciting. It's an opportunity for you to do things differently. A chance to experiment and change for after COVID-19. Blended learning is going to be here to stay, even in the school system, or especially in the school system. So better prepare your learners for the future. Particularly teach the kids how to use computers properly. Teach them digital literacy. Teach them the dangers of online learning. Teach them the dangers of online communication, But try something new and see what works and why. This can be a fun time if your ministry allows you to have the freedom to experiment, which I hope they will do. So what next? Well, I won't say this is the new normal, but the new normal will certainly include some blended learning, which will involve students going online even when they're in school. So it's working out what's best done online and what's best done face-to-face. And I have to say we have best practice for fully online learning, but we don't have it yet for blended learning because it's much newer. So again, you need to experiment and find out what works and what doesn't. But certainly we'll need students with digital skills to work in a digital world. They're going to have to learn how to work remotely in the future. They're going to have to know how to communicate using not just text and not just speech, but social media and other digital technologies. So online learning will help prepare them with digital skills for a digital world. And what we have to learn now is to get the right balance between in-person teaching and online learning and online and classroom learning. And all I can say to you all, teachers, I really do sympathize with you. This is a huge challenge for everybody. And I wish you all the best of luck and your students all the best of luck in the future. No, where are we?
Thank you very much, Dr. Bates, for your presentation. It was indeed, I believe, very helpful in practical terms of how to handle this situation and what teachers can do about it. And I have some questions that, and I believe that they are in the same, the way I read them, in the same practical, let's say, sense. I would stick to one question first that has been posed by many of the attendees: is how can teachers help parents set a schedule for their children? Is there something, let's say, some tips, some actions they can perform to help them, set this schedule that both you and Dr. Moore, identified as something essential, something important?
Yes, I again, the younger the child, the more structure you need. You need to have a time that is a study time where they sit down and know they're going to be doing learning and not playing. This will vary. I mean, this is an advantage of online learning because different parents will have different requirements here. Some parents will be working and won't be able to supervise the children until they get home, for instance. Now, again, the older the child, the more you can set them a schedule when you're out of the house, but come back and check that they've done the work. So give them a schedule. You say that one thing I would say about online learning: don't do it all in one chunk. It's best to split it up. Most research into online learning shows that even at university level, students rarely spend more than 1 hour in front of the screen doing one specific learning task. They tend to stop after an hour, get up, stretch, have a drink, a cup of tea, cup of coffee, then come back. So you've got to have a structure, but it's got to be flexible enough so that the student isn't sitting there for 3 hours at a stretch doing study. So say, okay, 9 to 10, this is do your math. Maybe 11 to 12, 10 to 11, you got some playtime. 11 to 12, do your English or do your Greek, etc. So, but just make sure. This is why you need to tell parents how many hours a week you expect the students to study, so that they can work out the best times for the students to do that, where they can either work on their own or they can work with the parent supervising. And again, that's why you have to be clear to the parent about when the parent needs to be there and when they don't need to be there. But the parent can choose the times. They have the flexibility to choose the times, so long. But the younger the child, the better it is to have it as a regular time. So they might say, okay, I get home from work at 5. We'll spend 5 to 6 together looking at what you've done. And then maybe 7 to 8, you do your own work. And I'm not going to be here because I've got other things to do. But just provide the structure that way.
And this exactly comes to another question that is in the same context, let's say, because there was a question about what should be communicated to the parents and how much they should be implicated in the educational process.
Yeah.
Now that the children stay home and unavoidably they are involved in the educational process.
I hate to say this, but the parent is a little bit like a prison warder. That they're the ones who make sure that the students are doing the stuff, but they don't tell them what to do. If the student asks a question and they can help with that question, fine. Or they can ask students about what the task is, what's the activity you're supposed to be doing, and maybe they can help them and maybe they can't. But they shouldn't feel guilty if they can't solve the math problem that the student's got. You can ask them, the parent can ask the child, what's the difficulty you're having? What else have you done? They can ask those kind of questions, or they can say, well, you should ask the teacher this. Ask the teacher this, because I don't know the answer. And in fact, when you do know the answer as a parent, it's often confusing to the child because it may be a different approach to the one the school's using. So it's very clear to get the distinction about student support, parent support, as distinct from parent teaching.
So in reality, you're saying that a lot of information has to be communicated from the teacher to the parents, like, for example, the schedule of the lessons or the learning outcomes. the learning tasks that
Exactly.
that students have to do, in order for the parents to be able to assist, not
Yes.
not to take over, but to assist.
Exactly, exactly. And parents should negotiate with their children. The older the child, the more negotiation you need. You know, anybody's had a 16 or 18-year-old, 17-year-old child, you can't tell them when they should study, but you should negotiate it with them and say, look, you know, this is still important that you learn, and this is why it's important. Now, yes, you want to meet with your friends, getting easier for them to do that now, but you know, that's fine. You organize when you meet with your friends, but you've got to get the work, the study done. And okay, let's choose the times when you want to study and when you want to go out and try and see a couple of friends in a safe social distancing manner, of course.
And in the same context, again, another question is, should teachers ask parents, let's say, to report on the learning achievements of their students?
No. Not in the sense that it's the teacher's job to look at what the students have done, not the parents. The parents can look at it, and if they want to give advice to the child, that's fine, but they shouldn't be required to report to the teachers. Their job is to make sure the kids do the work, and how they get to that, it might take different routes with different parents and different children. But the important thing is that the parents' responsibility is to make it's the same as getting them to school in the morning. It's, you know, the parents' job is to get them out of the house and get them breakfast before they go and get them to school on time if they're young. But it's not their job to teach them once they get there. And it's the same at home. It's their job to get them to sit down in front of the computer and do the work, but not to tell them what work has to be done and not report on that work. That's the great thing about online learning, is the teacher can see whether the students are actually doing the work or not.
Okay. Then there is I would say there are two other, let's say, for me, more difficult to answer questions. The first one is, and I think it's based on something in a point of your presentation that was presented over your presentation. There's a question: should teachers experiment with their students, or there should be something like a national strategy, a national policy of what is there to be taught and how it will be taught?
I don't see how you can have a national strategy when we don't know, really. This is the first time we've encountered a situation like this. So what is the national strategy going to be?
Let's say like a national, as I understand the question, like a curriculum and a way of teaching that is set by the state, by the ministry, or by...
I think the ministry should set guidelines about what kinds of learning outcomes students should achieve at a certain point in their year. But those outcomes have to be looked at as to how reasonable and practical they are if the student isn't in school. So, for instance, you could have an outcome for learning how to use a lathe in a workshop, for instance, you know, so that they can do carpentry and so on. But can they do that at home without the lathe? They can't. So you have to find another way of doing that. So it's a question of how much you trust the teachers. Now, I trust teachers. I think teachers generally, they've been trained in pedagogy. Not on, as I don't trust in university professors and that, because they haven't been trained in pedagogy, but school teachers have. So they should be given as much freedom as possible to achieve the outcomes that are set. And they should be able to communicate back to the ministry which outcomes are just not possible in a fully online manner. Now, be careful about that, because lots of things can be done online that teachers think can't be done online. But I would rather trust the teachers to get this right than the ministry, to be honest.
Okay, understood. And then last question. I think it's mostly a matter of, let's say, of the workload of the teachers. we're talking about, and you were talking about, the question is face-to-face for those students that can that can be on a face-to-face setting, let's say educational setting, combined with online for the students that are not able to attend this face-to-face setting.
Well,
do you think that it is possible to be handled by the teachers?
Let me be clear on this. If students are coming, let's say 3 days a week to school and 2 days not, that's one form of blended learning, right? You would do different activities in class than the students would do when they're at home. So you will only be dealing so the days that the same pattern should work for the teachers too. If students are at home on a certain day, the teacher should be teaching from home. They shouldn't be coming to the school. They come to school for the days when the students are there to do something different. So that's a different way of organizing it. I'm very unhappy about some school boards in North America which are saying children will come to school, but they'll have the same class that the children will have at home. It'll be a lecture, basically. They'll sit there listening to the teacher talking to a computer screen while students are at home. That is a terrible design. That won't work. This is where the administration becomes very, very important. If the administration set it up in such a way that it won't work, it's very easy to do that. We really need to focus on what needs to be done in school when students can do the rest at home and not try to duplicate what's done in class at home.
Okay, thank you very much. I think those were the main questions from from our attendees. We thank you again for your participation and your presence here with us. And I believe that it was very helpful and very instructing.
I would be very interested if you have a chat and you recorded the chat to know the comments from your teachers. I really hope to learn from them because we're all learning in this. I don't think there are any real experts in this because it's such a unique situation.
Dr. Bates, I have another one, last question, if you have time. You have mentioned it that there is need for the teachers to design their teaching in other ways, specifically for distance learning. What is your position about the way and the form of teaching, training, further education?
Yes, I think we need to relook at the way we train teachers. So I think all teachers should have some part in the teacher training program, in their teacher training certificate or degree, at least a topic on online learning and teaching at a distance, or particularly blended learning, how to mix online and face-to-face teaching. Actually, I think it's less of a challenge for school teachers because you have a system for training teachers and it's a question of just adapting the curriculum to this new reality. It's a much bigger problem in universities where we don't train professors in the first place to teach. So it's a much bigger step for them, I think, than it is for school teachers. But yes, I think there should be changes in the curriculum of the teacher training program. And I have to say that my book is used in the French version of my book is used by the Ministry of Education in France as part of their teacher training curriculum. It's called Teaching in a Digital Age. So unfortunately, there's not a Greek version, but maybe that can happen.
Yes. the tone is out now.
So I believe that with those questions, it pretty sums up, today's meeting. It was very nice, hearing all the presentations, and I believe that all the attendees, got very practical information about how to organize and what to expect on the situation and that. And we have to thank you one more time.
Okay.
And be sure that let's say that it was a very helpful let's say meeting for all the teachers here in Greece.
Efkaristo, and I'm sorry I couldn't speak Greek for you.
Και εμείς ευχαριστούμε πολύ.
Well, we wish you a good day.
Right. Bye.
Thank you very much.